over who controls border crossings into Syria and Jordan, critical bridges for a terror faction hell-bent on total Middle East domination. Today, Iraq said it took them back, but CNN can't confirm that. The Iraqi military also says it beat back ISIS fighters just about an hour's drive west of Baghdad. They also reported gains in Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's hometown, where they say they took out 2 senior ISIS figures, one who had appointed himself governor of that city. And with that sectarian divisions threatening to pull Iraq apart right now, Secretary of State John Kerry returned for his second visit to the country in as many days to urge Kurds not to give up on the country. Our chief national security correspondent Jim Sciutto sat down with Secretary Kerry in Iraq today. Jim joins us live from Brussels right now. And Jim, you know, the Kurds have said in language they really haven't used before that now is the time to split apart. Was Secretary Kerry able to get a different response from them today?
I'll tell you, the first words that Masoud Barzani, the Kurdish president, uttered to Secretary of State John Kerry today as he arrived in Erbil was that this is a new reality, a new Iraq, teeing up the idea that justifies Kurdish desires to separate. And when you're in Kurdistan, you get a sense of those divisions because it operates almost like its own country. The argument that we hear that Secretary Kerry gave to Barzani in response was to say, listen, hold those aspirations for now. What Iraq needs now is unity to fight this ISIS threat. But speaking to him, the Secretary heard a lot of promises over these last several days. Even the Secretary is skeptical as to whether they will follow through.
Secretary of State John Kerry traveled to northern Iraq today to press Iraq's divided leaders to join together or lose any chance of defeating the ISIS militants now threatening their country's survival. His first meeting with the Kurdish president Masoud Barzani, who just a day ago told CNN that Iraq was falling apart.
In your time here, have you seen any hard evidence of any of the parties involved willing to make compromises?
Words are cheap. I fully, I'm not taking anything I hear to the bank and saying, wow, it's going to be solved. But I'm hearing things that indicate to me that if they follow through on the things they're saying, there's a capacity to have a new government that could be a unity government.
12 days ago, June 12th, the president said that my team is working around the clock on options to respond. During that 12-day since, ISIS has captured an additional 11 cities and towns, a key refinery, crucial roadways and border crossings. Hasn't the delay in the administration's response here on the ground, military action, strengthened ISIS during that time?
I think the real question, Jim, is not sort of what happened in those days. The question is what can happen going forward to have a strategy that's really going to work.
More than 2 years ago, you were advocating for more robust support for moderate rebel groups inside Syria. When the president was considering military action in Syria, some said you gave the speech of your life, advocating for that action, explaining for it. Of course, it didn't happen. Since then, the war, and again, we have to speak of it across borders, Syria and Iraq, has only deteriorated. And I just wonder if you're personally frustrated to have watched that.
Let's be crystal clear, Jim. The reason that the decision to strike Syria didn't happen was because we ultimately came up with a better solution after the president made his decision to strike.
On chemical weapons, but that hasn't helped the calculus on the ground.
Well, but the purpose of the strike was to send a message to Assad, don't use chemical weapons. Not a strike that was calculated to end the regime or to get involved in the war directly. It was to end the use of chemical weapons. We found a better solution. We got all of the chemical weapons out.
But ISIS has only grown as a threat during that time period.
You're absolutely correct. ISIS has grown as a threat because countless numbers of jihadists are flocking to Syria to oppose Assad.
As in Syria, you get a sense that this is not an administration that is chomping at the bit for military action in Iraq. They're focused now very much on a political solution. But even on that, the secretary and others, they're waiting to see proof that the Iraqis, John, are up to that.
All right, Jim Sciutto in Brussels, thanks so much for that report and that interview. A UN human rights team announced today that more than 1,000 people have been killed in Iraq this month, most of them civilians. So what is the solution to end this bloodshed? What's the Obama administration doing to help right now? Is it enough? Joining me now from Capitol Hill is Republican Congressman Michael McCaul of Texas. He's the chair of the Homeland Security Committee, also serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
You have called ISIS the #1 threat to the homeland, to Americans on American soil. But in an interview overnight, the Secretary of State says ISIS does not yet have the ability to attack the U.S., and the administration is working to make sure they never can. Do you trust the administration here?
Well, I think they've been too slow to act, and I think this all started when the Status of Forces Agreement wasn't signed to leave a residual force behind in Iraq, and now it's empowered ISIS. I think that Maliki failed to engage the Sunni tribal leaders, and so al-Qaeda came back into Iraq. They have foreign fighters coming into Syria, and now I think their #1 goal at this point in time is to establish an Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, from which they have a vacuum where they can train terrorists and from which they can do external operations against the West, including the United States. So in my briefings, the Secretary of Homeland Security agrees with me that this is the #1 threat to the homeland.
Just to be clear, can they hit us now?
I believe that they're in the process of conducting planning for external operations, but I do think their focus right now is on creating this caliphate, if you will, this Islamic State of the Levant, as they call it. That's their #1 goal right now. That's why when I was on the Sunday shows, I talked about a dual strategy of targeted airstrikes against ISIS without collateral damage, while at the same time establishing a political and diplomatic solution to the crisis that Maliki has left behind.
So there's a new report out today that talks about extremist groups inside Syria, concerns that they may be receiving bomb-making training from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Have you seen any intelligence to this effect?
I have to be careful in discussing that. I know there are some connections there. I think one of the biggest threats we face from the airline aviation sector is the idea that's been reported of these non-metallic IEDs that can be built and taken onto airplanes. And remember, John, these people are coming not just from the Middle East, they're coming from Europe, the United States, from Australia. They have legal travel documents to travel outside the region. It's easier to get to than Afghanistan and Pakistan. And now it's a biggest training ground, far surpassing what we saw in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so that's why I view it as the biggest threat.
Well, I know you have to be careful here, sir, but we know there have been Americans who've gone over to fight in Syria. For all we know at this point, maybe they're crossing over into Iraq. Do you have concerns that these Americans may be receiving this bomb-making training from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and they may carry it back here to the homeland?
It's a serious concern because they can't come back into the United States or get on a flight inbound to the United States with materials that may not be detected through our screening. So that is why I am so focused on. We have been focused on this for the last 2 years in my threat briefing. So I think the administration, I'm glad they're finally in the region. We need a regional solution to this strategy. But the signs have been out there for quite some time.